Hi, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to the part 2 video for lecture 17 on moral relativism. In this video, we'll take a look at what James Rachels has to say about moral relativism, and more specifically, we'll offer then his case against moral relativism. In the part 1 video, we talked about Ruth Benedict and what she had to say in favor of moral relativism, so we discussed the case for moral relativism. In that first video, we also talked about what moral relativism is in general. It's the notion, right, that moral standards and truths, they exist, right? There is such a thing as morality, but they hinge on one's culture and one's society. Okay, so Rachel's then, as we'll see here in this video, is going to argue against that stance and try to say, you're right that there are moral truths, that there is such a thing as morality, but the difference then is you're wrong to say that it's dependent on one's surroundings. Okay, what we mean by morality, at least a large portion of it, Rachel's is going to argue, it shouldn't be thought of as being relative. Rather, it's universal. It applies across the board, no matter what culture or society we're talking about. At least it should be thought to. Okay. And then in the part 1 video, we also discussed, Benedict's notion of value bias and how she thought, again, that affects a lot of different aspects of our life. And contrary to our tendency to elevate our own standards, whatever tends to be popular around us, she wanted to emphasize that is just a kind of historical accident. We have this tendency to uplift our own popular standards and think of them as if they're somehow special, that with over time, everyone would be funneled towards these particular values. I mean, after all, look how popular they are. And she wants to say, well, hold up, that's more or less just a historical accident. Things could have worked out completely differently. In a completely different set of values, preferences could have become equally popular or more popular than the ones we think of as special because they happen to be popular nowadays. Okay. We talked about some examples she offers for relative values, homosexuality, trance-like states. That we talked about that really interesting culture where paranoia was, the essential ingredient in all walks of life, the cornerstone of their society, and so they deemed someone of cheery, sunny disposition who offered to help. They were the ones, right? That type of person was the one that was thought to be abnormal and the one that was subjected to asylums. But the person coming at you with a knife, thinking you're out to get them, no, that's just normal in that culture, right? So she's pointing to these different examples. Look at this particular type of behavior. It's both accepted and deemed normal, and also not accepted and deemed abnormal by these, at one and the same time, by these different cultures or these different groups of people. Okay, so in what sense then she wants to argue, right? Or she argued, can any of these behaviors be thought, or views on these behaviors or moral views be thought to be universal then, since they vary by culture, by the group of people we're talking about? And then finally, we discussed her notion of deviance, how given any sufficiently large population, okay, of people, you're going to have some that go against the grain, right? That go upstream, and are willing, or for whatever reason, just subscribe to the values that are abnormal in that culture and are willing to then, face the difficulties associated with that. She says, granted, there are going to be deviants in any sufficiently large population. The overwhelming majority of us are more than willing to just happily subscribe to whatever's popular in our particular society. It's almost like it's mindless, because, and again, as I tried to point out in that video, it makes sense though, right? Why would we want a difficult life? So at any rate, that's what we talked about in the part 1 video, and then in the second part video, we're going to turn our attention again to James Rachels. We're going to talk about what he has to say against the idea of moral relativism. I mean, Benedict does offer some convincing examples. She offers at the very least, a very popular defense of moral relativism. Okay, so Rachel's has then a difficult task here to show us why she's wrong, in general at least. Okay, so we'll take a look. We'll talk a little bit about who James Rachels is. We'll talk about what he refers to as the cultural differences argument, which essentially is what he calls or refers to or references The typical argument that's offered by moral relativists, he refers to as the cultural differences argument, and he's basically going to suggest it's not a good argument, right? It's invalid. He calls it unsound because essentially it's invalid, and so he's going to say they don't offer good support for their position. And then, as we'll see, he's going to concede, though, that in showing why their typical support for their position is no good, he hasn't actually proved that their theory is incorrect. And so then he turns his attention to doing precisely that. He says, well, what's going to happen if we accept, moral relativism and if we uphold it consistently? And he's going to talk then about a whole slew of negative consequences he associates with doing just that, right? Being a moral relativist. And then he's going to say, let's take a closer look at this premise, go back and take a closer look at this premise and ask ourselves, is it really the case that this is even true? And he's going to suggest, oftentimes the moral relativists overstate their examples, right? The examples they hold up as indicative of there being relative values, right? The different values at play here. He says, actually, they oftentimes overstate their case. And if you reflect further on those examples, actually underneath these apparently different set of values is the same set of values, core values. And so he'll reflect on some examples there, and then he'll say, in fact, to some extent, this can't be true because every existent culture, to even exist in the first place, has to have certain values in common. They have to value certain things. Okay, so that'll be his strategy, right? He's going to attack the typical line of argumentation offered by way of the moral relativist. Going to say why he thinks that's problematic, talk about some of the negative consequences associated with accepting the theory, and then also address this idea that different cultures actually have different values in the first place. And he's going to suggest that that's, again, overstated, generally not the case, and then emphasize that there have to be certain core values in place across all existing cultures. All right. Let's go ahead then and turn our attention to James Rachels and who this dude is. So, like Benedict, I'm not personally that familiar with Rachels. I have encountered him here and there, typically, in moral philosophy or moral philosophical discussions, classes and whatnot. I was a little bit more familiar with him than, say, Benedict, for what it's worth, but primarily I was familiar with what he had to say regarding moral relativism, and then also he does have some thoughts regarding ethical egoism. So again, I was working with an excerpt from The Elements of Moral Philosophy. That's his most well-known work. It was actually printed several times, several different editions. And in fact, the latest one, I think, was updated, and I think there was a foreword by his son, who is now actually teaching philosophy himself. I want to say in Alabama. So his son, intriguing figure. I was reading up a little bit on him. I think his name is Stuart Rachels. So again, teaches at Alabama as a philosopher himself, and was like a grand chess master or whatever they're called at the age of 11. So pretty smart guy himself. And so he was involved, I guess, in sort of revising or however you would put that, the most recent editions of his father's work, the most famous of which is The Elements of Moral Philosophy, like I mentioned. And so some of the quotes that I'll be referring to in this lecture are taken from, again, that book, The Elements of Moral Philosophy. And I was taking it from an excerpt in my previous textbook. That's where I was drawing most of those quotes from. So just wanted to point that out. So again, Rachel's contemporary American philosopher. I forgot exactly when he was born, but I know he died in, I want to say, 2003. Yeah, 1941 to 2003. So, like Benedict, relatively recent on the philosophical scene, at least in terms of philosophy. Again, thinking back, some of these guys have been, that we've discussed, have been dead for over 2,000 years. So, not the case with Rachel's. American contemporary philosopher, has a lot to say, obviously, about moral relativism. I think I mentioned in the first part video, that he's chiefly concerned with moral relativism because he's scared ultimately of moral skepticism. And I talked about this in the first part video, how there's those degrees in terms of the perspective regarding what we can know about morality, right? And the last step is like moral skepticism, or what the editors of our textbook call moral nihilism, where you just say there is no such thing as morality. Okay, moral claims can't be defended, and so on and so forth. And that's what Rachel's is super worried about, people falling into that camp. And he thinks if you accept moral relativism, well, that's only one small step then from endorsing. We talk about moral subjectivism as well, right? That would be another step in the process, but it's only one step away, he would argue, from complete moral skepticism, the denial that there's any such thing as morality at all. And you can kind of see why that would be the case if you start with moral objectivism, this idea that there are moral truths, right? And it's independent of what groups of people or individuals think of morality, right? There are these moral truths, and they exist independently of what we think of them, right? You start with that, but then if you then start moving this way, right, on that spectrum that we talked about, and start saying things like, well, there are moral truths, but they depend on what groups of people say, right, or think about morality. Or you go even further and say there are moral truths, but they depend on what each individual thinks. Well, Rachel is going to say, well, if you start making those concessions, well, you're going to get to the point where you start wondering, well, is there any such thing as moral truth at all? Right? I mean, if you're going to say it hinges on perspectives, right? In what sense is there any objective truth to the matter at all? And that's his worry, right? That you'll then end up here and start to say things like, well, really, there's no such thing as morality. There's just, like Nietzsche will say, there's just personal preference. And that's what really scares Rachel's, and why he turns his attention to moral relativism and this tendency. I think that he would probably agree with Benedict that it is becoming a more popular moral theory. This tendency to accept moral relativism, and he wants to say that is we should be cautious of that, and that can be very troubling, given then what it might lead to, especially. All right, so I guess I could mention. So this is from Rachel's himself when he discussing moral relativism. He says, right, quote, "We find that it is not so plausible as it first appears to be," end quote. So again, it is enticing. He was on board with this idea that it seems to be increasing in popularity, as Benedict suggests. And so that's why he wants to encourage us, hold up, let's reflect a little bit further. And he wants to say if we do that, then it won't be as appealing as it seems to be for many of us at first. Okay. And so again, his big worry is moral skepticism. And he says, accordingly, quote, "This line of thought is probably," that being moral relativism, "has probably persuaded more people to be skeptical about ethics than any other single thing." So again, this line of thought, moral relativism, has probably persuaded more people to be skeptical about ethics or moral philosophy than any other single thing. Right? It tends to lead to this more than any other worry or any other thing. And so again, that's the reason why he's paying particular attention to moral relativism then. Okay. With that said, then, let's go ahead and turn our attention to the first sort of step that he takes in order to dismantle the moral relativist position. And I do like how he's very clear in terms of what he's doing or what he's up to. So first, he's going to assess this typical argument that the moral relativist gives us. He's going to suggest why it's problematic. Then he's going to say, I concede that I haven't actually proved, again, that the theory is incorrect. I've just shown why the support they offer stinks, right? And so then he's going to turn his attention very clearly to try to then show that it is incorrect. What happens when we accept moral relativism? What sort of consequences do we have to be willing to take? And he says they're not good ones. And then he goes back, like I said, and he's going to analyze, is it in fact the case that this is true? The different cultures have different moral values. He's going to say, not really, right? Overstated. But I like how he is very procedural in how he goes about things here, and is very clear in what he's doing. Like I said, whoops. Okay, so let's turn our attention to this first step in his strategy, if you will, what he refers to as the cultural differences argument. Let's talk a little bit about that. So he points out, he says, look, different. So what the moral relativists, how they will typically approach things. They'll point out things like, I think we mentioned this example in the part 1 video. Different societies or cultures have different approaches to dealing with the dead. Some cremate them, some bury them, some even eat them. Okay? Right, that's an example of a particular type of argument often given by the moral relativist. And so the conclusion that the moral relativist thinks follows is that therefore there's no objectively proper approach to dealing with the dead. Okay, so that's one example. You could, do the same thing with respect to any kind of moral issue, right? The moral relativists will say, right? So, for example, homosexuality. This particular culture accepts it. This particular culture doesn't. Ostracizes it. And so, premise: different cultures have different views of homosexuality. Then the conclusion the moral relativist wants us to make is that there's no proper, correct view with respect to homosexuality in that case. Okay? And so in general, so those are some specific examples. And so then he characterizes the argument in general as this, right? So the cultural differences argument. So the general form of it is, the moral relativist points out different cultures have different moral values. And then the conclusion they want us to reach in general is that there are no objectively proper or correct moral values to subscribe to because different cultures have different ones. Okay, so that's the, the cultural differences argument. Okay, and that was on slide 11. Should have been mentioning what slides I'm on here. Okay, so turning our attention to then slide 12, he wants to say this is problematic. Okay, specifically, he says that it's unsound because his point is, even if this is true, this can be false. But going back to lecture 2, right? Technically, we would say that renders the argument invalid. If that's the reasoning why, he finds this problematic, well, that means it's invalid, which of course means, as we learned in lecture 2, that it's also unsound. So again, to be valid, it's not possible assuming, granting the premise that the conclusion can be false. And what he's saying is, that's not the case here. We'll grant the moral relativists their premise for the sake of argument here. Go ahead, and later he's going to question it, right? But right now, let's go ahead and give them this, okay? This can be true, he wants to say, and nevertheless, this can still be false. What does it matter that different cultures have different views of how to deal with the dead? He wants to say it could still be the case that there is an objectively proper way to deal with them. Okay? And some of the cultures then happen to be wrong, and some of them happen to be right. Okay, so he wants to say just because this is true, this doesn't have to be. This can still be false, which then makes the argument, renders the argument invalid and then unsound, as he says. Okay. So as he points out, the premise here pertains to what people believe, okay, while the conclusion states something about what's actually in fact the case. Okay. And those don't connect, right? The conclusion's about a different issue, about something else, what's really the case, whereas this is about what people believe is the case. Okay? Two different things. Okay. And so he draws an analogous example, turning to slide 13. Why do we have this propensity when it comes to moral values? Take other examples, and we would think of this sort of inference as ludicrous, right? So one I was thinking of is, different people take a multiple choice test, right? Different students choose different answers. They have different views on what the right answer is. Does that mean that the teacher shouldn't go through and, grade some of them as being right and certain ones wrong? Does that mean there's not an objectively proper, correct answer? No, obviously not, right? We still go through and we say, well, this person was wrong insofar as they guessed B, the answer was actually D. And so again, same thing he wants to say, just because different cultures believe different things about how to deal with the dead, doesn't mean that there's not an objectively proper answer. Now, he's not saying that there is or what that answer would be, right? He's just saying you can't draw this conclusion based on this. Okay? And an example, and I really like his example, the analogous example he offers in the text, right, in his own book, is geography, right? The shape of, the Earth. So people have different geographical views, and especially recently, it seems like we hear more and more about, people that believe in a flat Earth. Okay? And again, regardless of what the objective truth of the matter is, he's pointing out, just because some people believe it's roughly round and some people believe it's flat, maybe some people believe it's a triangle and trapezoid and so on and so forth, does that mean, therefore, that there is no proper objective truth to the matter, that the Earth doesn't have an objective shape then? No, obviously not. It does have a real shape, right? We might not know ultimately what it is. Some would argue that, right? But there is an objective truth to the matter, and just because different people have different opinions or views of it, doesn't mean that there's not some objective truth to the matter. And so he's saying the same thing. Okay. Quote, does it follow from the mere fact that people disagree that there is no objective truth in geography? Of course not, end quote. So again, Rachel wants to say, we see it clearly, the fallacy involved here with respect to drawing that kind of inference with regard to other things. You know, students taking a test, they provide different answers. That doesn't mean there's not ultimately a correct answer. Okay? Same thing with respect to the shape of the earth. People have different views, doesn't mean there's not actually a shape to the earth. Okay? So why is it then that the moral relativist thinks that that's okay to do with respect to moral values? Why is it okay to make that sort of inference when it's not proper in these analogous, similar situations? Okay, so that was slide 13. Let's go ahead and erase this and turn our attention to then slide 14. Now, I've been mentioning this point, right? Rachel's is clear. What I've done up to this point hasn't actually demonstrated that moral relativism is false. All I've done is shown that the typical kind of argument offered by the moral relativist isn't any good. Okay? But I haven't actually shown that moral values and standards aren't in fact relative. So let me turn my attention then to doing precisely that. So the first sort of strategy he employs to do this is he says, let's take a look at the consequences we have to be willing to accept if we adopt and endorse and uphold consistently moral relativism. So he's going to say, look, there are some very negative consequences associated with, we'll just say MR here, moral relativism. Okay. So, for example, the first consequence he alludes to, and this is at the bottom of slide 14, quote, we can no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own, end quote. This seems problematic, he wants to say, right? Insofar as then we have to sit idly by as these other cultures are practicing things that we feel very strongly against. So, for example, racism or slavery or anything along those lines, or murder or something like that, right? If we're a moral relativist, who are we to judge, condemn another culture, right? We only have license to condemn or judge those within our own culture. Right? And moral standards and truths hinge on one's culture and environment and one's surroundings, right? And you only have license implied in that, right, is to thus judge those within that culture, within your own culture, in your own surroundings, your own environment. Okay, and the upshot then, he wants to say, what seems problematic about that is, aren't there certain things that we want to feel the license to condemn, no matter what the culture says? And I think I mentioned something along these lines when we talked about moral conventionalism, way back in lecture 3 when we talked about Hobbes' theory. If you are of the opinion that certain things, murder, rape, slavery, they're just wrong no matter what, okay, well then moral conventionalism, I think that might qualify in some sense as a version of moral relativism. Moral conventionalism and moral relativism shouldn't sit well with you, right? Because they're saying that whether or not rape, murder, slavery, so on, whether those things are wrong, it depends. It hinges, okay, on whether or not the group you're in says it's wrong. Okay? Or in Hobbes' case, it hinges or depends on whether the laws of your group, right, the contract, says it's wrong. Then and only then, right, if it says it's wrong, or the group in some sense says it's wrong, then and only then are murder, slavery, and rape wrong. Okay? Well, again, if you're the type that wants to say, no, these are just wrong, period. No exceptions. Okay? Well, then moral relativism shouldn't sit well with you. And that's the kind of, that's the thrust behind what Rachel's is saying here, right? There do seem to be some things that are just fundamentally wrong no matter what. And if we accept moral relativism, we don't have, or we shouldn't, if we're being consistent, we shouldn't have the license to condemn those fundamentally wrong things that are taking place in these other groups of people or in these other cultures. So again, he wants to say that, quote, slavery and anti-Semitism seem wrong wherever they occur. Certain things just are wrong, aren't they? He wants to say. And again, if we accept moral relativism, we can't. Who are we to say that sort of thing? At least in a universal sense, and turn our focus to these other cultures and say that. Who are we to again? The idea is implicit in moral relativism is all cultures, all groups are on equal standing, right? There's none of these are more indicative of the truth or on the right path more than another, right? They're all sort of equal, and so again, there shouldn't be any judgment of one another involved. And he wants to say, I that seems problematic. Okay? Murder, slavery, rape. These all seem like things. At least Rachel's wants to suggest that we should feel licensed to condemn no matter what. So, second negative consequence he brings up is kind of the flip side of that, I think, and this is the top of slide 15 where I mentioned this one. The flip side of that, he says, quote, we could decide whether actions are right or wrong just by consulting the standards of our society. In fact, that's the only way you could figure it out, according to the moral relativists. You just look to your own society, your own culture, those around you. Well, that's equally problematic in the same kind of way, insofar as, let's say it's your culture, the group around you that's practicing these things that seem fundamentally wrong: murder, rape, slavery. So, wouldn't it be problematic then to suggest that the only place we turn for moral guidance is that very group that's practicing these things that don't sit well with us? And so, again, he wants to suggest that seems problematic. The idea then that the only place we can look to, right, for guidance is our own culture, and that whatever that culture says, our own culture says, goes no matter what. That seems problematic insofar as it is at odds with, things that we sort of want to believe in at a fundamental level, like murder's wrong, slavery's wrong, etc. Okay. And then third, I like this point. This seems like a distinct but related point. This idea that just as we shouldn't, at least if we're being consistent moral relativists, we shouldn't be judging other cultures. Well, so too, in at the same time, right? At the same that exist at the same time, we have no license to judge these other cultures. Well, then he's pointing out, well, so too, that applies historically too, right? We have no license to judge past cultures, just like we have no license to judge these other cultures that exist right now, for the very same reasons. Okay, moral standards and truths hinge on particular cultures, right? And just because the slavery that was practiced in this culture, 200 years ago, is thought of as being wrong in our present culture now, doesn't mean that it was wrong back then. In fact, it was, arguably, right, at least in some cultures, endorsed, right, by the culture in general. So again, we shouldn't have license then to make any sort of judgments across time and condemn, prior cultures for anything they practiced. Right? And he wants to say, isn't that troubling? Insofar as, again, they're practicing things that seem deeply troubling at a fundamental level, that don't seem acceptable no matter what. Right? So, in his words, he says, quote, the idea of moral progress is called into doubt. Quote, to say that we have made progress, right? So in other words, to imply that there is something better about our culture because we don't practice slavery, whereas that prior culture 200, 300 years ago did, right? You're implying that there's some sort of progress involved, right? Yours is better. But that's precisely the kind of thought he wants to say the moral relativists shouldn't have, right? Insofar as they're being consistent. Again, because all of these disparate cultures are on equal footing in terms of their merit. There is not one or the other that's closer to the truth than the other. So in his words, quote, to say that we have made progress implies a judgment that present day society is better. And that is just the sort of transcultural judgment that, according to cultural or moral relativism, is impossible, end quote. And by the way, you do hear moral relativism referred to as cultural relativism as well. Okay? So stop thinking that we've improved, right? Stop thinking that things have gotten better because now, we don't have slavery anymore. Okay, you're implying in that sort of thought or suggestion that we've progressed, and hence that our current culture is in some way better than those past cultures. And as a moral relativist, he wants to say you shouldn't be saying that. And conversely, he wants to argue, doesn't it seem like we have made progress? don't we want to feel like we have the license to say that things have improved from a moral perspective, that we are improving, that there is such a thing as moral improvement? Well, if you want to be able to say those kinds of things, if you want to be able to think of humanity as improving over time from a moral perspective, as if our cultures now that don't practice slavery are better than these prior, cultures that did, well, then you better abandon moral relativism, he says, because that won't allow you, if you're being consistent, to make those kinds of judgments, to think that kind of way. Okay, so that was slide 15. Now let's turn our attentions, sort of the next strategy that he employs. Let's turn our attention back to that premise of the cultural differences argument. So he wants to know, is it in fact, remember we granted it when he was analyzing the CDA, or the cultural differences argument, to begin with. He just granted the premise was true. And he said, it doesn't matter, your conclusion still doesn't have to follow. This is still a terrible argument. Okay, and now he wants to say, well, again, is it actually true? Let's go back and analyze the premise. Is it actually true the moral different cultures adopt and endorse these different values? Right? So is the premise of the cultural differences argument actually true? Okay. And he's going to say, kind of analyze this in a two-step manner. First, he's going to say, take a look at the typical examples, or some of the examples offered by the moral relativists, and say how those are generally overstated, okay, and that what's at play is actually very similar values when you reflect further. Okay, so he'll say the examples offered by moral relativists are overstated or overblown, or however you want to put the point. And then he's going to say, at least it can't be true that all with respect to all moral values, these different cultures have different views. They have to view some things in common to even exist in the first place. So he's going to say some elements of morality have to be universal. Have to be. And sometimes I debate whether it's productive to put it this way, but I think it's perhaps useful to think of it this way. The upshot of all this is going to say, it's going to be him saying, at the very least, you can't be an absolute moral relativist. You can't think of everything about morality as being relative. There have to be, at the very least, some elements of morality that are universal. Okay, and we'll expand on why he thinks that is here in a moment. So going back to this, what is he up to here? He's turning his attention to the premise of the cultural differences argument, the notion that these different cultures, or these different groups of people, societies, actually do in fact have fundamentally different views regarding values or morality, or however you want to put it. And so he's going to approach that in a two-step manner. Okay, so that is what we'll do then. Go ahead and turn to then slide 17. So he says, look, one of the examples that the moral relativists will hold up is that, hey, there's some cultures that eat cows and some cultures that don't, right? And that seems to be a very stark difference then. That seems to be an extreme, a difference in terms of what they value, right? And he wants to say, well, if you reflect further, oftentimes in the culture, or at least, the examples that are brought up by the moral relativists, the culture that doesn't indulge in eating meat, it's because they believe in reincarnation. They believe, in other words, that, as Rachel's puts it, that the cow could be grandma reincarnated, or someone they loved and knew reincarnated. And so that's then the impetus for them refraining from eating the cow. And so he wants to say, actually, what's at play, right, is the same fundamental core value that's at play in this other culture, and that's loving and appreciating grandma. Right? So what seemed like a difference in values is actually underneath it, right, a difference in beliefs, not in difference in values. The one thought cows could be grandmas, reincarnated, while the other culture didn't think that. But what they valued underneath it, right, these different beliefs, stayed the same, right? They valued grandma. and they don't want to hurt grandma. And so that's why then the one culture, Rachel suggests, doesn't eat meat or not eat cows, right? And the other culture does. So, as he puts it, quote, the difference is in our belief system, not in our values. We agree that we shouldn't eat grandma. We simply disagree about whether the cow is or could be grandma, end quote. So, not a good example, right? Because, again, what underlies the seemingly different values is actually just different beliefs, and the same core value, loving, not wanting to hurt grandma, is still at play. And then he says another example that is oftentimes offered by moral relativists. The Eskimos or Inuits in their practice of infanticide or killing their youth. This is held up as an example. This culture believes in that or values killing their youth, and obviously, other cultures don't. And Rachel's supposed to say, well, come on, hold up here. Let's reflect a little bit more. Why is it in these instances? Why is it that this culture kills their youth in these instances? It's because they have no other alternative. So he points out the extreme, harsh environmental circumstances that Eskimos, or I guess Inuits is the proper term to use, the Inuits were confronted with. It doesn't happen, to my knowledge, I haven't looked into this for a long time, but I don't think this practice is, common at all anymore. Back when it happened, things were a little bit different. And again, what Rachel's is saying here is that it's not like they just killed their youth willy-nilly. They had to in order to be able to migrate and deal with the extreme harsh environmental conditions that they had. They only had a certain amount of food to supply to the group, so on and so forth. There are these various reasons that Rachel's alludes to that explain why, as a last resort, they did it not because they valued killing their youth, but because they had to, right, in order to save the society at large in general. Okay? So, in Rachel's terms or words, quote, the explanation is not that they have less affection for their children or less respect for human life, but they live in a harsh environment where food is in short supply. So they had no other choice. Again, it was always, he points out, it's always a kind of last resort. So that's him suggesting, even in cases where it seems like there might be different values at play, when you reflect further, it's oftentimes the case. You can see then that there's actually similar values in play. Even in the Inuit example, they value their youth, right, just as we do. Okay, turning to slide 18, he's going to say, well, and if you think about it, there have to be certain values that are common to all existing cultures for them to even survive in the first place. Okay, so that premise that different cultures have these different moral values, that can't be true across the board in an absolute sense. So going back to the way I put it earlier, you can't be an absolute moral relativist. You can't think of everything about morality, kind of upshot here, at the very least, you can't think of everything about morality being relative. There have to be certain things that apply universally across all cultures, across all groups of people. They have to value certain things, again, for them to even exist in the first place, Rachel says. So the upshot of this is that not everything about morality can be viewed differently by these different groups of people. So it's undermining in the premise of the CDA or the cultural differences argument. So in his words, he says, quote, for example, quote, all cultural groups must protect their infants. So this idea of valuing their young, even in the example we just gave, right? They still valued their young. They just killed their youth when they had to as a last resort. Well, all cultural groups must protect their infants. If a group did not care for its young, the young would not survive, and the older members of the group would not be replaced. After a while, the group would die out. Makes sense, right? So she also mentions, and I think I've alluded to this one before, or he also mentions that we also have to prohibit murder. Otherwise, people are going to be killing each other. Pretty soon, society will fall apart. And by the way, while I'm thinking about it, not that this is a big deal, but just referred to him as her, and I realized going back and reviewing the first part video that when I was discussing the questions at the very end of the lecture, I referred to the first question I mentioned. Do you agree with Rachel's? When actually it should have been Benedict, right? But anyway, small mess up there as I did here. So Rachel's also suggests, okay, in addition to valuing the youth, you also have to have a prohibition of murder across all existing cultures or groups of people, or they're not going to survive for long. I think he also mentions, a prohibition against lying in a general sense. Otherwise, there won't be a requisite trust, and at some point, the society will fall apart. So he says, there are certain values that have to exist for the culture or the group to even survive and flourish in the first place. Okay. So, and what specifically with respect to that idea of prohibiting murder, that has to be, universal as well. Okay. Since without it, he says, quote, society on any large scale would collapse, end quote. Okay. So I think that, both these sides make pretty compelling case. And so, as I've drawn this analogy before, I feel like I'm in the middle of a tug of war here. Benedict makes good points on her side, but on the other hand, Rachel's makes some pretty compelling points here. And I think maybe, ultimately, and I think this is kind of where Rachel's ends up. He doesn't want to say that everything we associate with morality is necessarily universal. But I think the gist of what he wants to get at is that there have to be these core elements, at least, of what we mean by morality that are universal. Okay, but maybe it's the case that certain things like dress, how we, the clothes we wear and so on, maybe that's not something that need to be thought of as universal, right? Maybe that can be thought of as relative. Okay, so the whole point being, right, maybe it's not the extremes. Maybe not everything about morality is relative, and maybe not everything about morality need be universal. Okay? And I think Rachel's is probably indicative of what Rachel's would suggest. Right? He's not necessarily suggesting that everything about morality need be thought of as being absolute. Okay? But he wants to make the case. You can't be, you guys on that end of the spectrum, the same applies to you. There are elements of what we mean by morality that cannot be thought of as being relative, okay? For all the reasons we've been discussing. And who knows, maybe Benedict would ultimately agree too, right? That, pointing out that these different cultures have these different approaches to elements of morality, maybe she just wants to stress upon us that there are at least some elements that are relative. Right? But maybe she doesn't want to insist that all of it's relative. Okay, so again, they both fall somewhere on the spectrum, right? Rachel's wants to encourage us to go lean more this way, okay, and think of morality as being essentially more universal, right? Whereas maybe Benedict wants to say, think of it as being more relative. But, they're not necessarily committed to saying everything about morality is relative or everything about morality is universal. Okay. Now, Rachel's, if you want to suggest we should have license, I feel the license to criticize, condemn other cultures that are engaging in certain practices, well, you owe us some means to figure out when that's the case, right? And he does that to his credit. So turning to slide 19, he offers what I consider kind of like a utilitarian principle, more or less, upon which to judge culture. So he offers an example in the book where he talks about this African girl, 17-year-old, and this was, I guess, a famous case back in the 1990s. In 1996, fled to America, and forgive me if I screw up some of these circumstances. It's been a while since I've read up on the case, but it was something like her. So the typical practice was basically female genital mutilation at a certain age, right? They would perform this on all the girls, and I think it was her father that was kind of sheltering her, protecting her from this practice, and he dies. And so then everyone else, the grandfather I think was involved, was then going to ensure that this practice was performed on her, and so she flees her country, her African country, and flees to America. And so this is a big ordeal. Again, America wasn't sure, the U.S. wasn't sure what to do at the time, so it was a big, I guess, international event of sorts. And so he homes in on this example and says, let's take a look at this example. This is the sort of thing, Rachel's speaking here. This is the sort of thing that we ought to condemn. He says, look at all the arguments in favor of this practice. They don't make any sense. He says, the males in the society will say, well, it will be less likely that the females will be promiscuous if they, have this this practice performed on them. But Rachel says that's ludicrous. That's BS, more or less, not a good enough reason. And so Rachel wants to make the case there's no social benefit to be gleaned ultimately, right, upon due reflection from this kind of practice. And so if that's the case, so again, it seems kind of utilitarian. If on a whole it doesn't seem to be serving social welfare, then get rid of it. Right? So he points out this practice, this kind of female genital mutilation at a certain age that this country was practicing. This didn't seem to offer any benefits. And he says, when trying to decide whether or not to condemn or criticize another culture's practice, he says, quote, we may ask whether the practice promotes or hinders the welfare of the people whose lives are affected by it, end quote. And so in this case, he wants to say, when it hinders their welfare more than it helps, it's hindering it, then get rid of it, right? Or at least we ought to feel the license to suggest that, right? And this is precisely the sort of thing he wants to argue, or he argues that accepting moral relativism doesn't allow us to do. Okay. Let's turn to slide 20 and we'll wrap up with, I always appreciate, I mentioned this before, philosophers, anybody really, who, when they're involved in a debate, they don't proceed as if the opposition is completely crazy. And so we'll wrap up to that point, right, to that end, with Rachel's conceding some benefits of the opposition. So this is funny too. It's kind of a nice segue to our last lecture with Nietzsche, because he's on the opposite end of the spectrum. Love him or hate him, whether you agree or not, ultimately with what Nietzsche says, except I guess his earlier works being the exception, he proceeds in a very different fashion, famously, right, very antagonistic. Talks as if, especially towards the end of his writing career, proceeds as if the opposition is completely clueless, doesn't have any idea what they're talking about, and so on. So I think I contrasted at one point, and I mentioned how I similarly like Mill for this, the same reason that I like Rachel's here. And I think at that time I contrasted, Mill with Nietzsche, how Mill, conversely, as Rachel's doesn't proceed as if, the opposition is completely crazy. Okay. So again, to his credit, Rachel's does suggest that we can glean some benefits from moral relativism, the theory. As he says, first of all, it makes us aware that, hey, maybe not all values are in fact universal. So this supports what I was saying a moment ago, right? That we need not think of Rachel's as suggesting that everything about morality is universal. He just wants to say there have to be some elements, right, important elements that are not relative. Okay? But some of them might be relevant. Maybe the way we dress, for example, or what's appropriate at the dinner table, or something like that. Maybe that that need not be universal, and moral relativism helps us figure that out or realize that, hey, my way is not the only way of doing things or looking at things. Okay, as he says, quote, many but not all of our practices are merely peculiar to our society, and it is easy to lose sight of that fact. In reminding us of it, the theory, or moral relativism, does us a service, end quote. And so kind of the upshot of that then is we become more aware of these alternate ways of thinking and believing and so on. And so in some sense we become more accepting. Okay? We have more of an open mind. Okay? So that's the second benefit he thinks moral relativism can offer us, as long as we don't go overboard with it then. So in his words, quote, cultural relativism, by stressing that our moral views can reflect the prejudices of our society, provides an antidote for this kind of dogmatism. Okay, it helps us keep an open mind. It's not, my way is not the only way. All right, that is the case against moral relativism by way of James Rachel's and what he has to say. So we've seen now the case for moral relativism, thanks to Ruth Benedict, and now we've seen the case against moral relativism, thanks to James Rachel's. So I'll leave you with the reflection time questions here. What are your thoughts about moral relativism? Now you've seen both cases. Where do you stand ultimately? And then, just as I asked you to judge Benedict's case for moral relativism, setting aside where you stand on the theory, what do you think about the case Rachel's presents in favor of his position? Do you think you might nevertheless ultimately still be a moral relativist, right? But do you think he presents a good case against it? Okay? Or maybe you're ultimately against moral relativism, but you think the points he raises aren't that good in supporting that position. So one way or another, what do you think? Okay? Where do you ultimately stand? And what about morality in general then? Are there certain elements that are universal that we ought to think of as being universal, and then certain elements that are relative, or is everything about morality, should everything about morality be thought of as universal, as someone like Kant would seemingly suggest? Okay, whatever's true morally applies universally across the board. Okay, so he would be one on that complete end, that end of the spectrum, extreme end of the spectrum. Everything about morality is universal. Or, do you lean towards the other end of the spectrum? Everything about morality is relative. Where do you fall ultimately? So that's moral relativism. Nice segue. Rachel's worry. Why is he so worried about moral relativism? Because of what we have on tap next, moral skepticism, or what the editors of our textbook refer to as moral nihilism. So we'll end the course with our discussion of moral skepticism. Friedrich Nietzsche is going to tell us, essentially, that we've been wasting our time this entire course. We've just wasted hours and hours and hours of our time in discussing all these various self-deceptions. He's going to suggest that morality is a great self-deception. It's an illusion. It's something that we being 99% of people endorse, subscribe to for the sake of comfort, getting by. Most people, he's going to say, struggle with the pain and suffering involved in life, and so they need these kinds of self-deception to get through it. But underneath it all, Nietzsche's going to argue there's nothing to morality, right? That there is no such thing as morality, a proper way that we ought to behave, okay, or a proper set of values that we ought to all uphold. So we'll take a look at his case for that. What a better way to end the course, than with someone who says everything we did for the course was a waste of time. Whether or not he's correct in that, obviously, we'll leave that up to you to figure out. We'll go through, again, the case he makes for that position, for moral skepticism. And I should say, I've been mentioning off and on throughout the course that, all in all, a fan of the textbook, but I'm not a fan of what they provided for Nietzsche, since he's so well known for, things he says against morality. I was surprised they didn't offer a better selection or a better excerpt for, that's more indicative of what he has to say about morality. Instead, our excerpt deals with sort of our ability to reflect, right? Think about the past, and then so to be more forward thinking, right? Other animals, they don't have that reflective capacity where they can sort of stew about the past and get depressed about what happened in the past. And so to fear what's coming in the future, right? They're instead ever present in the moment. So we get an excerpt on that, which is fascinating in its own right, but how it's necessarily indicative of his moral skepticism, I don't know. And so, I'll elaborate a lot more on what Nietzsche says. We'll talk about what is in our excerpt, but the point here is that I'll have a lot more to say in the lecture. We'll have a two-part series for that lecture as well, two-part video series. In the first part, we'll talk about Nietzsche and his philosophy in general. And the reason for doing that is because you can't really understand his criticisms of morality without first having a grasp of, his more general philosophy, his thoughts about reality, and so on. And so same thing with respect to religion and his, criticisms of religion. And so I do the same thing in my chapter on Nietzsche in my dissertation. I preface, what he has to say about religion by discussing his more general philosophy. So the part 1 video will introduce Nietzsche and we'll discuss his more general philosophy. And then the part 2 video, we'll dive into his criticisms of morality, more or less, and get into his very famous distinction between master and slave moral theories, which I'll argue really is fundamentally a distinction that reflects individual mentalities towards existence and towards life. Right? Yes, there are master and slave moral theories, but more importantly, there are master and slave individuals, okay, and mentalities. Are you a master or a slave? Nietzsche's going to say ultimately it'll boil down to your existential attitude. Are you one who can't get over the pain and suffering in your life and bemoans every little thing and is constantly dwelling on the pain and suffering? Then you're a slave, and you're likely going to indulge in all sorts of self-deception to get by because you're not strong enough and healthy enough to accept life as it is. Alternatively, are you one who is optimistic? Maybe you're out on the streets and homeless, but you don't dwell on the fact, and you're constantly willing to take life as it is in its entirety. You don't deceive yourself about facets of life, what Nietzsche would say, right? And you generally embrace life and are optimistic and cheery. Well, then you're a master. And so much more obviously on that, but that's then all going to, so this existential attitude and one's fundamental view of life, that then we'll talk about that and how that then underlies his view of morality and sort of a lot of what he has to say regarding morality in general. Okay, so a lot more on Nietzsche, obviously, and moral skepticism, the idea of moral skepticism in lecture 18. So without further ado, I'll end this lecture. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion of moral relativism, both the case for and the case against. And until next time, see you later.